The second film explains how to write a systematic review of reasons, that is, a systematic review of all the reasons that have been given for or against a specific position. It also identifies key issues. The case for writing such reviews was made in a previous film called The Need for Systematic Reviews of Reasons in Reason-Based Bioethics. As explained in the previous film, writing a traditional systematic review in medicine or epidemiology follows a detailed protocol. After formulating the research question and the conditions a publication must meet in order to be included in a review, one conducts a reproducible search designed to try to identify all the publications that meet these conditions. The result should be the whole literature that addresses the research question. Then, for each publication, one extracts the conclusion reached, that is, the publication's answer to the research question, and one assesses the degree to which one should believe it. Sometimes, and as recommended when writing guidelines, one weights the conclusion to reflect this degree. Last, the systematic review draws an all things considered conclusion based on the entire literature, taking into account the degree to which we should believe the conclusions reached by individual publications. The first step of formulating the research question differs depending on what type of systematic review one is conducting. To briefly recap, a traditional systematic review of the medical literature, say, asks a factual question about a physical outcome, such as, in humans aged 18 or over, does smoking at least 12 cigarettes a day versus smoking less than 12 cigarettes a day increase the lifetime incidence of lung cancer? A McCullough model systematic review of reason-based bioethics asks a question of the same form, except that the outcome is ethical, not physical. The McCullough team's example is, in patients with mental disorders, is use of concealed medications in food or drink, rather than prescribing medications in the usual way or forcibly administering them, ethically justifiable? Daniel Streck and I propose a different model for writing systematic reviews of reason-based bioethics, which address a factual question about reasons given. A sample question is, which reasons have been given for the views that participants in a drug trial should or need not be ensured post-trial access to the trial drug? One then formulates conditions for including or excluding publications identified by the search. Our inclusion conditions were, I quote, a publication, for example, article, should be included if and only if it includes a reason why post-trial access should or need not be provided, and the post-trial access is for former participants in a drug trial, and the post-trial access is to a drug tested in a trial, and the publication is a peer-reviewed, published academic article or book, a national level report or working paper, or a PhD thesis. It will sometimes be necessary, as it was in the case of our review, to explain how to interpret the inclusion conditions or to justify why they were chosen. The second step is to conduct the search. Depending on the topic, it may be necessary to use databases in science, medicine, law and ethics, and thesis databases. The selection should be made in collaboration with experts. For each database, one should first check the controlled vocabulary to see if it contains the research question's keywords, in our case, post-trial access. If it doesn't, one identifies some publications that meet the inclusion conditions and the database-specific controlled vocabulary that was used to index these in the database, and keywords such as post-trial follow-up, and one classifies the resulting terms into content classes. One then joins terms in the same content class by or, and joins all or alternatively some of the resulting strings by and to form database-specific search strings. One should also search as systematically as possible for and within relevant reports and books, and examine the in-text references, footnotes, and bibliographies of qualifying publications for further publications that possibly meet the inclusion conditions. Reference management software should be used to record all the searches and to quantify the overlap between searches and between databases. It's important to acknowledge the limitations of the search and to explain why the search is nonetheless valid. When writing a traditional systematic review of a medical literature, or a McCullough model systematic review of a reason-based bioethics literature, one extracts from each publication included in review the conclusion reached. One also assesses the quality of the underlying empirical study or reasoning, respectively, to assess the degree to which we should believe the conclusion reached. However, when writing a systematic review of reasons, one needs to extract detailed information about reasons presented and publications. And it is the extraction and presentation of this detailed information that presents some of the most interesting technical and conceptual issues. We can only present a handful of these here. For each publication, one needs to extract each occurrence of a reason and assign it to a broad type of reason, such as avoid exploitation, and a narrow type of reason, for example, avoid exploiting research participants. Types should be given short, self-explanatory names to keep lists of reasons accessible to decision makers. However, it isn't quite that simple. A key decision to take is whether to assign types to reasons in text passages based on the language used in the passage, for example, the word reciprocity, or indeed to the concepts that the language expresses, the concept of reciprocity. Coding on the basis of language minimizes bias because different reviewers should agree on what language is used in the passage coded. The problem is that sometimes authors use the same term, such as reciprocity, to express different concepts of reasons, such as the concepts of reciprocity or of distributive justice. When language usage is inconsistent, it is not possible to code passages based on their language alone. One must apply codes partly based on the concepts expressed. But unfortunately, many concepts are poorly distinguished in the literature, and some actually overlap. And there can be equally justifiable ways to split broad types of reason into narrow ones. Even supposing that a team of reviewers could reach agreement on how to code a specific passage, a different team of reviewers might code differently. This risk of bias is a real problem. We can't call our review systematic unless bias is minimal, and it is important to realize that the issue of whether our proposed reviews are properly called systematic is not merely definitional. Systematic reviews have a special authority in decision-making, in clinic and policy-making. Our replies are that, first, even when codes are applied partly on the basis of concepts expressed, the level of bias is low when coders work independently to apply codes to passages in included publications, and there is high intercoder reliability. In other words, coders frequently apply the same codes to the same passage. And second, we should not hold systematic reviews of reasons to too high a standard. Many systematic reviews in medicine, for example, also have unavoidable bias. So to recap, our proposal is that each reason given for the view that post-trial access must be ensured, or for the view that post-trial access need not be ensured, should be assigned both a broad type of reason and a narrow type. But how do we code arguments with multiple premises, each of which expresses a different reason concept? We call these arguments complex reasons, and here is an example. Requiring sponsors to ensure post-trial access will reduce their incentive to conduct research, which will result in a loss of potential benefits to countries that would otherwise have hosted research, Therefore, sponsors should not be required to ensure post-trial access. Note that even if one applies two broad types of reason to this passage, say incentive and stakeholders' interests, the pair will fail to capture the causal relationship that the author's claim obtain between the reduction of the incentive to conduct research and the loss of potential benefits to those who would otherwise have hosted research. Unfortunately, more complex coding systems may make the review less accessible to decision makers. Our compromise solution to coding complex reasons is therefore this. We assign two broad types of reason to the passage and then treat the pair of codes assigned as a distinct type. If the review counts the number of types of reason, and this is an issue to which I return later, it must explain that some types of reason occur both independently and as part of a complex reason. Authors may differ in the implications that they think a reason has for whether participants should or need not be ensured post-trial access. This is an important fact about how reasons are used that the analysis needs to capture. We assigned a number, 1, 2, or 3, to each occurrence of a reason depending on whether it's used to argue for or against ensuring post-trial access, or whether the sliders claim to have implications for ensuring post-trial access, but the implications are left unspecified. There are challenges. The way we coded implications assigns the same code to, that is, a reason against, both to reasons given why post-trial access need not be ensured and to reasons given why post-trial access should not be ensured. And it applied the same code, 1, a reason for, to reasons why post-trial access in particular should be ensured and reasons given why post-trial access or some other possible benefit should be ensured. To avoid extracting nonsense data, we needed to increase the complexity of the coding schema somehow. Our solution was to code not only the type of reason and its alleged implications, but also the particular conclusion drawn from the occurrence of the reason as distinct from the publication's overall conclusion. The general message here is that reviewers must stay aware of the limitations of their coding schema and make adjustments as necessary. The systematic review should also present information on whether publications that use a reason to argue for a specific conclusion all accept the reason or all reject it, or whether some accept it and some reject it. To enable this, reviewers need to assign a number to a reason occurrence to code the attitude taken to it as follows. 1, for reason is endorsed in all cases within a specific publication. 2, the reason is endorsed in some cases. For example, this code can be applied to moral reasons that are considered to apply in some but not all contexts. We assigned 2 to a reason that we coded as reciprocity when the author wrote that in some contexts reciprocity supports giving post-trial access, but in other contexts reciprocity fails to apply and has no implications. 2 can also be applied to factual claims. For example, one of our publications claimed that when a trial drug is effective, post-trial access should be ensured to research participants. We assigned 2 to the factual antecedent, that is, the trial drug is effective. It's an antecedent whose truth varies between contexts, and thus, according to the publication, gives a reason to ensure post-trial access only in some contexts. We assigned the number 3 when it was unclear if the reason is endorsed or rejected by the authors, and 4 if the reason is rejected. Now, the number code needs to be applied on the basis of the whole publication, not just the quotation expressing the reason. Where the author's attitude to a reason changes, the context and order should be used to decide which attitude is authoritative. The application of these codes raises a number of complex issues that we discuss in our paper. Here is just one. Rejected reasons receive the same attitude code, irrespective of whether they're considered irrelevant or based on incorrect, factual, or moral premises. Whether to try to capture this information, which is potentially useful for decision makers, should be decided by reviewers on a review-to-review basis. I mentioned earlier that we decided to extract from each occurrence of a reason in a publication not just the broad and narrow type of reason, the alleged implication of the reason and the author's attitude to the reason, but also the conclusion drawn from the particular occurrence of the reason about whether or not post-trial access should be ensured. This was necessary because whereas some literature discussed whether there are moral obligations to ensure post-trial access, other literature discussed whether post-trial access should be legally required or whether we should accept specific interpretations of guidelines where the interpretations require it. Some of these reasons qualified for inclusion in the systematic review. So, we developed codes for the action to which the conclusion refers, for example, funding post-trial access to the trial intervention, and for the alleged bearer of the obligation, for example, researchers, and for whether the action was said to be permissible, forbidden, or required. We also noted when the conclusion drawn from the reason obviously did not follow from it. Again, reviewers faced the question of how broad or narrow codes should be. Decision makers need simple data, which argues for broad codes. But if the codes are too broad, the data becomes meaningless. A systematic review of reasons will also need to collect data on publications, just as a traditional systematic review of, say, of medical literature collects data on the studies it includes. How many publications were included? When were they written? Which genres and fields are represented? Such data enables assessment of the state of the field and helps to identify gaps, for example, when the issue has received little attention from philosophers. I haven't mentioned collection of data from publications on which other publications they cite, but that data will also show when scholars in different fields working on the same issue are unaware of each other's work. Obviously, the data to extract may vary with the literature reviewed. The presentation of results in the systematic review of reasons differs substantially than in a systematic review of medicine or McCullough model systematic review of a reason-based bioethics literature. The key exhibit of a systematic review of medicine or a McCullough model systematic review will be the literature's all things considered answer to the research question, a medical question or an ethical question. But the key exhibit in the case of a systematic review of reasons is a list of reasons that is the answer to the question of which reasons have been given for the views that post-trial access to the trial drug should or need not be ensured, for example. This list will generally be too lengthy to include in the abstract of the systematic review. The written systematic review must include a flowchart that describes the selection of publications included in a review. Together with a verbal description of the search strategy, this enables readers to reproduce the search and assess the likelihood that the review included all the publications that met its inclusion conditions. A table of the characteristics of publications included enables assessment of the state of the field and helps identify gaps. But the key exhibit is the list of all the reasons mentioned in the literature. This should also show whether each reason was used by the different publications that mentioned it to argue just for the view in question or just against, or whether some publications used it to argue for and others against. This helps decision makers and philosophers to identify the relevant and then the strong reasons and be aware of different interpretations and uses of the same reason. This list is the answer to the research question of which reasons have been given for the views in our case that post-trial access to the trial drug should or need not be ensured to trial participants. When a literature is very difficult to retrieve, as in the case of the literature on post-trial access to the trial intervention, it is a good idea if the review contains a list of all the publications included. Where the search was very complex, a list of databases searched with the database-specific search strings helps make the search reproducible. And particularly when users of the review are likely to be interested in the positions taken by individual publications, and when it takes specialized skill to extract this information from the publications, Decision makers may find useful a table that shows for each publication the reasons endorsed by the publication, whether the reason was used for or against the view in question, the conclusion drawn from each reason, and the attitude taken by the author, and the publication's overall conclusion. A key question is whether reviewers should also present data on the frequency with which each type of reason is used. We found, for example, that the most frequently mentioned reason in discussions of whether post-trial access should or need not be ensured was avoiding exploitation, particularly when there is disagreement on the implications of the reason for ensuring post-trial access, as in the case of avoiding exploitation. This frequency data helps focus the discussion on where it could be most effective in resolving disagreement and in finding reasonable, intractable disagreement. Conversely, identification of reasons that are seldom used can help identify areas for further development. So if this frequency data is to be included, the number of times a type of reason occurs in the literature should be counted only when repeats of the reason within the publication have been removed. We address the tricky question of what to count as a repeated reason in our paper. One problem with counting is that counts of reasons potentially mislead decision makers if they tend to think that the most frequently used reasons are the strongest ones. We don't know if this is the case, but if it turns out to be, then extreme caution should be exercised when writing systematic reviews of reasons for decision makers, and possibly this frequency data should be omitted. Another concern is that counts of broad types of reason may be meaningless when broad types cover many diverse narrow types, or when there are equally good reasons for classing the same narrow type of reason under different broad types of reason, or when types could be made broader or narrower. In the case of our review, we decided to present counts of finely individuated narrow types of reasons, but there were still ineliminable limitations which we needed to acknowledge. A last concern with counting reasons is that this makes no sense when the same reason is used to support different conclusions. So reviewers must be careful as to what they count and adapt existing strategies that enable writers of systematic reviews of the medical literature to derive meaningful data when the studies they review address very slightly different research questions. To very briefly summarize these two short talks together, in the first talk, we argued that there is need for systematic reviews of reason-based bioethics, a point on which we agree with the McCullough team. But against the McCullough team, we think these should be systematic reviews of reasons, not systematic reviews that aim to derive the literature's all things considered ethical conclusion. In the second talk, we explained the process for extracting and presenting this detailed information on reasons, and we argued that while there are some sources of bias, some of which may be ineliminable, such systematic reviews can nonetheless achieve substantial validity. Thank you.